Picture this: a 9-year-old boy steps off a ship in France, barely speaking the language, mocked for his accent, bullied for his foreign origins. Within 25 years, that same boy would crown himself emperor and bring the greatest powers in Europe to their knees. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose ambition knew no bounds, whose military genius rewrote the rules of war, and whose fatal flaws would ultimately destroy everything he built. August 15, 1769. On the rugged island of Corsica, a place caught between Italian heritage and French conquest, Napoleon Bonaparte was born into a minor noble family that was barely holding on to its status. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer who had reluctantly accepted French rule over Corsica just a year before Napoleon's birth. The island had been sold by Genoa to France, and the Corsican people resented their new masters. This tension would shape young Napoleon's early identity. The Bonapartes were not wealthy. They had a title, yes, but little money to back it up. Carlo worked the system, leveraging every connection he had to secure opportunities for his children. And Napoleon, the second surviving son, was clearly different from the start. Intense. Serious. Burning with something his family couldn't quite name. At 9 years old, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend military school. Imagine the culture shock. He spoke French with a thick Italian accent. He was small, skinny, and poor compared to the sons of French aristocrats who surrounded him. They called him names. They mocked his heritage. But here's what they didn't understand. Every insult, every rejection, every moment of being treated as less than was being stored away, converted into fuel for an ambition that would eventually consume Europe. At the military academy in Brienne, Napoleon discovered his gift. Mathematics. Strategy. The science of artillery and fortifications. While other boys played and socialized, he devoured books on military history, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal. He studied their campaigns obsessively, memorizing terrain, analyzing decisions, understanding the psychology of leadership and conquest. His instructors noticed something unusual. This Corsican outsider had a mind that worked differently. He could visualize battlefields in 3 dimensions. He understood how terrain, weather, morale, and timing intersected in ways that determined victory or defeat. He graduated from the prestigious École Militaire in Paris in just 1 year instead of the usual 2, becoming an artillery officer at 16. But here's the critical thing to understand: in 1785, when Napoleon received his commission as a second lieutenant, France was still an absolute monarchy. The military was dominated by aristocrats who bought their positions through family connections. Talent meant little. Birth meant everything. Napoleon, despite his noble title, was still seen as a provincial outsider. His career seemed destined for mediocrity. For years, Napoleon remained a minor artillery officer stationed in sleepy provincial towns. He was brilliant but unrecognized, ambitious but constrained by a system that valued bloodline over ability. He spent his time reading, writing, thinking. He was obsessed with Corsican independence at first, even writing pamphlets supporting his homeland's freedom from French rule. The irony is staggering. This future emperor of France once dreamed of liberating Corsica from the very nation he would come to dominate. But then, everything changed. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded across the nation. The old order, the aristocracy, the monarchy, the entire social hierarchy that had kept Napoleon down, began to collapse. Suddenly, the rules were being rewritten. Talent could rise. Merit could be rewarded. For a young, brilliant, hungry officer with nothing to lose and everything to prove, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Napoleon watched carefully as France tore itself apart, as kings and nobles lost their heads to the guillotine, as radical factions fought for control. He understood something crucial: in chaos, there is opportunity. In revolution, a man with vision and will could reshape the world. The nobody from Corsica was about to make his move. December 1793. The port city of Toulon on France's Mediterranean coast had betrayed the revolution, opening its gates to the British Navy. For the struggling French Republic, this was a disaster. Enemy warships now controlled a vital strategic position. The revolutionaries sent army after army to retake the city, and they failed repeatedly. Then, a 24-year-old artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte arrived with a plan so audacious that senior officers dismissed it as the fantasy of an inexperienced upstart. But Napoleon didn't care what they thought. He had studied every siege in military history. He understood something the generals had missed: you don't attack a fortified city head-on. You seize the high ground, position your artillery to dominate the harbor, and force the enemy fleet to abandon the port or be destroyed. Within weeks of taking command of the artillery, Napoleon had transformed a failing siege into a masterclass of military strategy. His cannons rained hell on the British ships. The harbor became a death trap. On December 19, the British fleet evacuated, and Toulon fell. The Republic was saved, and overnight, this unknown Corsican officer became a name people remembered. He was promoted to brigadier general at 24 years old. The outsider was forcing his way inside. But let's be clear about the France that Napoleon was rising through. This wasn't a stable nation celebrating liberty. This was a country devouring itself. The revolution had spiraled into the terror. Maximilien Robespierre and the radical Jacobins were executing thousands, including former revolutionaries who weren't extreme enough. Paranoia was everywhere. One wrong word, one suspected disloyalty, and you could lose your head. Napoleon walked this tightrope carefully. He had connections to some Jacobins, which made him suspect when Robespierre fell in July 1794. For a brief, terrifying moment, Napoleon himself was arrested. The trajectory that had seemed so promising nearly ended at the guillotine. But he talked his way out, proved his loyalty to the new government, and survived. This experience taught him a critical lesson: in revolutionary politics, you must be valuable enough to keep alive but not threatening enough to eliminate. For a year, Napoleon was sidelined, given minor assignments, kept away from the action. He was broke, frustrated, watching lesser men receive commands he deserved. He even considered leaving the French army to offer his services to the Ottoman Sultan. Imagine that alternate history. But then came October 5, 1795, and another crisis that would change everything. Royalist rebels in Paris rose up against the revolutionary government, threatening to overthrow the fragile republic. The government was desperate. They needed someone who could put down an armed insurrection in the streets of the capital without hesitation. They called on Napoleon. What happened next became known as the whiff of grapeshot. Napoleon positioned his artillery on the streets leading to the government buildings and, when the royalist mob advanced, he gave the order to fire. Grapeshot, dozens of metal balls that turn a cannon into a giant shotgun, tore through the crowd. It was brutal. It was decisive. It was exactly what the government needed. The insurrection was crushed in hours. Napoleon had proven he would do what needed to be done, no matter how bloody. The government rewarded him by making him commander of the Army of the Interior. At 26, he was now one of the most powerful military figures in France. But Napoleon wasn't interested in domestic peacekeeping. He wanted glory. He wanted conquest. He wanted a command that would let him prove he was the greatest military mind of his generation. In March 1796, he got his chance. The Directory, the five-man executive ruling France, gave him command of the Army of Italy. On paper, this seemed like a consolation prize. The Italian front was a backwater, the army was underfed, undersupplied, and demoralized. France's real focus was on the battles against Austria and Prussia in Germany. Italy was an afterthought. Napoleon saw it differently. Italy was his opportunity to do the impossible. When Napoleon arrived to take command, his soldiers saw a short, thin, intense young general who looked more like a mathematician than a warrior. He was 26 years old, commanding men who had been fighting since before he left military school. They were skeptical. Then he spoke. He promised them something no general had offered before: victory, plunder, and glory. He told these starving soldiers that across the mountains lay the richest lands in Italy, Milan, Venice, Turin. And that he would lead them to conquest and wealth beyond imagination. But more than promises, he gave them something they'd been missing: a plan and the confidence of a man who believed absolutely in his own genius. What happened next stunned Europe. In less than a year, Napoleon fought and won battle after battle against Austrian and Italian armies that outnumbered him. He moved his forces with unprecedented speed, striking where the enemy least expected, dividing superior forces and destroying them piecemeal. He broke every conventional rule of warfare and won doing it. At the Battle of Arcole, he personally grabbed a flag and led a charge across a bridge under withering fire, a moment immortalized in propaganda paintings that made him a hero across France. At Rivoli, he defeated an Austrian army nearly twice his size through pure tactical brilliance, maneuvering his forces so masterfully that the enemy never realized they had the numbers until it was too late. By 1797, Napoleon had conquered most of northern Italy, defeated 5 Austrian armies, and forced the Austrians to sign a humiliating peace treaty. He did this largely on his own initiative, often ignoring or contradicting orders from Paris. The Directory had sent him to Italy as a minor distraction. He returned as the most famous man in France. But here's what's crucial: Napoleon wasn't just winning battles. He was building a legend. He understood propaganda and public image in ways that seem modern. He sent carefully written dispatches back to Paris, always highlighting his genius, his courage, his indispensability. He commissioned paintings, encouraged poetry, crafted his own mythology. The nobody from Corsica, the bullied boy with the accent, had become Napoleon Bonaparte, the savior of France, the conqueror of Italy, the general who couldn't lose. He was 28 years old, and he was just getting started. Europe had no idea what was coming. July 1798. Napoleon stood before the pyramids of Giza with 40,000 French soldiers baking in the Egyptian sun, thousands of miles from home. He turned to his men and declared, "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It was brilliant theater, but beneath the dramatic gesture lay a darker truth: this entire campaign was a catastrophic gamble that was already falling apart. Why was the conqueror of Italy leading an army to Egypt? Because Napoleon had become too powerful, too popular, too dangerous for the politicians back in Paris. The Directory feared him, so they'd approved his wild scheme to invade Egypt, cut Britain's route to India, and build a French empire in the east. They hoped he'd either succeed spectacularly far away or fail and disappear. Napoleon knew this. He went anyway because staying in Paris without a war to fight meant becoming a political target. But weeks after arriving in Egypt, the British Navy under Admiral Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and annihilated it. Napoleon's army was now stranded in a hostile desert, cut off from reinforcement or retreat. The gamble had failed before it truly began. Napoleon did what he always did when trapped: he attacked. He marched his army into Syria, besieging the fortress of Acre in 1799. He needed a victory to salvage the campaign, to prove he could still work miracles. But Acre wouldn't fall. The siege dragged on for 2 months. His soldiers died from combat, disease, and heat. Plague swept through the army. Napoleon visited the sick personally in a propaganda move to show he was fearless, but visiting sick soldiers doesn't cure plague. Meanwhile, back in France, everything was collapsing. The gains from his Italian campaign were being lost. Austrian and Russian armies were pushing French forces back. The Directory was weak, corrupt, incompetent. France was losing the war and losing faith in its government. And the great Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who never lost, was stuck failing to conquer a single fortress in Syria while his men died of disease in a desert half a world away. Then the dispatches from France arrived. Napoleon read them carefully. The Directory was imploding. France needed a strong leader. His enemies were moving against him politically. If he stayed in Egypt, his career would be destroyed by politicians in Paris. He made a decision that would define his character forever: he abandoned his army. In August 1799, Napoleon secretly boarded a ship with a handful of trusted officers and left 28,000 soldiers stranded in Egypt under the command of his subordinate, General Kleber. He sailed for France, gambling that he could arrive home, seize power, and make people forget about the disaster in Egypt by focusing on his past glories and France's present crisis. It was selfish. It was ruthless. It was politically brilliant. November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. Napoleon, working with key conspirators including his brother Lucien and the politician Size, launched a coup d'état to overthrow the Directory. The plan was to claim a fictional Jacobin conspiracy threatened the Republic, move the government to St. Cloud Palace outside Paris for safety, and then reorganize the government with Napoleon in charge. It almost failed spectacularly. When Napoleon entered the Council of 500 to demand they dissolve themselves, the delegates erupted in fury. They saw through the conspiracy immediately. They surrounded him, shouting, "Outlaw him! Down with the dictator!" Some physically grabbed him. Napoleon, the fearless battlefield commander, panicked. His face went pale. He stammered. His brother Lucien later said Napoleon was on the verge of fainting. This was the moment everything could have ended. If the council had voted immediately, Napoleon would have been declared an outlaw, which meant anyone could legally kill him. But Lucien, who was presiding over the council, stalled for time. He refused to allow a vote. He sent word to the troops outside. Napoleon's loyal grenadiers stormed the chamber with fixed bayonets. The politicians scattered, some jumping out windows to escape. The coup was saved by military force, not political skill. By the end of the day, Napoleon and his conspirators had declared the Directory dissolved and established a new government, the Consulate, with 3 consuls supposedly sharing power. In reality, Napoleon was named first consul, which meant he held all real authority. At 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was now the effective dictator of France. He'd gone from abandoned child at military school to master of the French Republic in 2 decades. But he wasn't satisfied. Being first consul wasn't enough. He'd tasted power, and he wanted more. Over the next 4 years, Napoleon systematically transformed France and consolidated his grip on power. He wasn't just a general anymore, he revealed himself as a brilliant administrator and legal reformer. He created the Napoleonic Code, a unified legal system that replaced the chaotic mess of feudal laws. It guaranteed property rights, religious tolerance, and civil equality while also reinforcing patriarchal authority and crushing workers' rights to organize. It was progressive and authoritarian at once, much like Napoleon himself. He negotiated the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, healing the breach between revolutionary France and the Catholic Church. This was political genius. Millions of French Catholics could now support Napoleon without feeling they were betraying their faith. He created the Bank of France, stabilized the currency, and reformed education. He built roads, bridges, monuments. He made the government work efficiently for the first time in a decade. But make no mistake, every reform, every institution, every success was designed to strengthen his personal power. Napoleon wasn't building a republic. He was building a launching pad for empire. In 1802, he had himself declared first consul for life through a plebiscite, a referendum where French citizens could vote yes or no. The vote was a sham, manipulated and coerced, but the result was what Napoleon wanted: 3.6 million yes votes versus only 8,000 no votes. He now had democratic legitimacy to rule France for life. But life wasn't enough. Napoleon looked around at Europe and saw kings, emperors, dynasties stretching back centuries. He'd risen from nothing to rule France, but he was still technically just a public servant, a consul in a republic. His power had no permanence, no hereditary guarantee. His enemies could still dismiss him as an upstart commoner. So Napoleon decided to become what he had once fought against, an emperor. He would crown himself, establish a dynasty, and force the ancient powers of Europe to acknowledge that the nobody from Corsica was now their equal, or their superior. The gambler was about to place his biggest bet yet. And for a while, it would seem like he couldn't lose. December 2, 1804. Inside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Pope Pius VII sat on his throne expecting to crown the new Emperor of France. Instead, in a moment of breathtaking audacity, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned his wife Josephine as Empress. The symbolism was unmistakable. Napoleon owed his power to no one, not the church, not lineage, not divine right. He had crowned himself through his own will and genius. Europe's ancient monarchies watched in horror and fascination. The Habsburgs of Austria, the Romanovs of Russia, the Bourbons of Spain, dynasties that traced their legitimacy back centuries, now had to contend with a Corsican upstart who'd simply declared himself their equal. Some sent representatives to the coronation, tacitly acknowledging his legitimacy. Others began plotting his destruction. Napoleon didn't care. He had an army of over 500,000 men, the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. He had reorganized his soldiers into the Grande Armée, a force built on merit, mobility, and revolutionary fervor. And he was about to show Europe what that army could do. December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon fought the Battle of Austerlitz in what is now the Czech Republic. It would become known as his masterpiece, the battle that proved his military genius beyond any doubt. The situation looked desperate. Napoleon faced a combined Austrian and Russian army of 85,000 men commanded by two emperors, Francis II of Austria and Alexander I of Russia. Napoleon had 68,000 troops. The coalition forces held the high ground on the Pratzen Heights. Every conventional military principle said Napoleon should retreat and wait for reinforcements. Instead, he set a trap. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable. He sent false intelligence suggesting he was afraid and wanted to negotiate. The coalition commanders took the bait. They moved troops off the Pratzen Heights to attack Napoleon's weak flank, planning to cut him off and destroy his army. The moment the heights were thinned out, Napoleon struck. His concealed forces stormed up the slopes in a coordinated assault that split the enemy army in two. The coalition forces, now divided and confused, were systematically destroyed. Thousands of Russian soldiers fled across frozen ponds. Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire on the ice. Men and horses plunged into freezing water and drowned. By the end of the day, the coalition had suffered 27,000 casualties. The French lost 9,000. Austria sued for peace immediately. The Russian army retreated in shame. Napoleon had defeated two emperors on the battlefield, on the anniversary of his coronation. The propaganda value alone was incalculable. Over the next 2 years, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. He crushed the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, battles so one-sided that the legendary Prussian military was humiliated. He marched into Berlin in triumph. He defeated Russia again at Friedland in 1807, forcing Tsar Alexander to meet him for negotiations. The Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807 marked Napoleon's zenith. He met the Russian Tsar on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, neutral ground where they negotiated as equals. Napoleon redrew the map of Europe. He created new kingdoms and gave them to his brothers. Joseph became king of Naples, then Spain. Louis became king of Holland. Jerome became king of Westphalia. His stepson Eugene ruled Italy. Napoleon controlled directly or indirectly everything from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia, from the Baltic Sea to southern Italy. He had achieved what no one since Charlemagne had managed, the unification of most of continental Europe under one ruler. But beneath the triumph, cracks were already forming. Napoleon's empire wasn't built on loyalty or shared values, it was built on military conquest and enforced cooperation. Every nation he defeated resented French domination. Every king he installed faced rebellions. Every treaty he imposed was seen as temporary until French military power could be challenged. In 1808, Napoleon made his first catastrophic mistake. He invaded Spain, overthrew its monarchy, and installed his brother Joseph as king. He thought it would be quick and easy. Spain was weak, divided, poorly armed. He was wrong. The Spanish people rose in revolt. Priests, peasants, soldiers, and nobles united in guerrilla warfare against the French occupation. They attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, disappeared into mountains and cities. The French controlled the roads by day. The guerrillas owned the night. Napoleon sent army after army into Spain, eventually 300,000 troops, and they couldn't pacify the country. This was warfare Napoleon didn't understand. There were no pitched battles to win, no enemy capital to capture. The Spanish simply refused to submit. They would fight, lose, scatter, and fight again. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon later called it, bled his empire of men, money, and morale year after year. Meanwhile, Britain remained undefeated. Napoleon had won every land battle, conquered every continental power, but he couldn't cross the English Channel. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. After Nelson destroyed the French fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, any hope of invading Britain died. So Napoleon tried economic warfare instead, the continental system, a blockade designed to strangle British trade and force their surrender through economic collapse. Here's something most people don't realize about the Black Death: it didn't end in 1353. That first catastrophic wave was just the beginning. The plague became endemic in Europe, returning in cycles every 10 to 20 years for the next 400 years. There were major outbreaks in 1361, 1369, 1374, 1400, 1438, and dozens more. London experienced significant plague outbreaks roughly every decade until the Great Plague of 1665. The last major outbreak in Western Europe occurred in Marseille in 1720. These later outbreaks were never as devastating as the initial wave, partly because the most vulnerable had already died, partly because populations were smaller and less dense, and partly because people developed better, though still imperfect, methods of containment. But each recurrence brought fresh trauma, killed thousands, and reminded Europeans that death could return at any moment. This constant threat fundamentally shaped European psychology for centuries. The plague became woven into the fabric of daily life. People made wills young, knowing they might die tomorrow. Art remained obsessed with mortality. Literature was permeated with awareness of death's proximity. The phrase, memento mori, remember you must die, became a cultural touchstone. Europeans lived with a visceral awareness of life's fragility that's difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. But paradoxically, this intimacy with death also liberated the survivors. If death could come at any moment, if all worldly status dissolved in the face of plague, then perhaps the rigid hierarchies and restrictions of the old world mattered less than people had thought. Perhaps individual achievement, personal merit, and human potential mattered more than birthright. This shift in thinking was one of the forces that would fuel the Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance. That extraordinary flowering of art, literature, science, and humanistic thinking, emerged directly from the ashes of the Black Death. This isn't coincidence. The plague created the conditions that made the Renaissance possible. First, there was wealth. The plague had killed people, but it hadn't destroyed property or gold. The survivors inherited everything. In Florence, wealthy merchant families like the Medici accumulated enormous fortunes in the post-plague economy. They had money to spend, and they spent it on art, architecture, scholarship, and culture. Patronage flourished. Artists like Donatello, Botticelli, and later Michelangelo found generous sponsors willing to fund ambitious projects. Second, there was a shift in values. The medieval focus on the afterlife gave way to greater interest in earthly existence and human achievement. If life was short and uncertain, shouldn't we celebrate human creativity and potential while we can? This humanistic philosophy, placing human experience and reason at the center of intellectual inquiry, became the foundation of Renaissance thought. June 24, 1812. Nearly 700,000 soldiers, French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, crossed the Niemen River into Russia. It was the largest invasion force ever assembled. Napoleon rode at its head, confident this would be his greatest triumph. He planned to advance rapidly, force the Russian army into a decisive battle within weeks, crush them as he'd crushed every other army, and dictate peace terms in Moscow by September. But the Russians refused to play by his rules. Instead of standing and fighting, they retreated. Every time Napoleon's forces approached, the Russian army pulled back deeper into their vast country. They burned crops, destroyed supplies, evacuated towns. They were using Russia's greatest weapon, space. Napoleon's supply lines stretched longer and longer. His soldiers marched through empty, scorched land finding nothing to eat, no forage for the horses, no supplies to capture. Napoleon kept pushing forward, convinced the decisive battle was just ahead. His marshals grew increasingly worried. Soldiers began deserting in shocking numbers, not from cowardice, but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, he'd lost over 100,000 men without fighting a major battle. 70 miles from Moscow, the Russians finally stopped retreating. Field Marshal Kutuzov positioned his army on defensive ground and waited. Napoleon finally had the battle he'd been seeking, but it wasn't the brilliant maneuvering and decisive victory he specialized in. It was a brutal, grinding slaughter. Napoleon threw his soldiers against Russian fortifications in direct assaults. His artillery fired over 60,000 rounds. Men died by the tens of thousands. The smoke was so thick commanders couldn't see the battlefield. By nightfall, over 70,000 soldiers lay dead or wounded, 30,000 French, 40,000 Russian. It was the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. The Russians retreated again, but this wasn't the crushing victory Napoleon needed. His army was hemorrhaging men and morale. But Moscow lay ahead, and Napoleon convinced himself that once he took the Russian capital, the Tsar would have to surrender. He'd won wars before by capturing enemy capitals. This would be no different. September 14, 1812. Napoleon entered Moscow to find it nearly abandoned. The governor had evacuated the population and, that very night, fires began breaking out across the city. Whether the Russians deliberately burned their own capital or the fires were accidental remains debated, but the result was catastrophic. Moscow burned for 5 days. 3/4 of the city was destroyed. Napoleon waited in the ruined city for 5 weeks, expecting Alexander to negotiate. No message came. The Tsar was willing to let his ancient capital burn rather than submit to Napoleon. Supplies were running out. Winter was approaching. Napoleon faced an impossible choice: winter in a burned-out Moscow with a starving army, or begin the long retreat back to France. On October 19, he ordered the retreat. It was already too late. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's greatest military catastrophes. Napoleon's army, already weakened by battle and hunger, now faced the Russian winter, Cossack raids, and their own desperation. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze to death while marching. Horses died by the thousands, leaving artillery and supplies abandoned in the snow. The Russians didn't need to fight pitched battles. They just harried the flanks, picked off stragglers, and watched Napoleon's Grande Armée disintegrate. Discipline collapsed. Men fought each other for scraps of food. Officers abandoned their units. The retreat became every man for himself. At the Berezina River in late November, the retreating French army found the bridges destroyed and Russian forces closing in from 3 directions. Engineers worked in freezing water to build temporary bridges while the army held off Russian attacks. Thousands drowned or were crushed in the panic to cross. Thousands more were captured or killed by Russian forces. Napoleon abandoned his army again. In early December, he left the survivors under the command of his Marshal Murat and raced back to Paris in a sleigh with a small escort. He needed to reach France before news of the disaster destroyed his political position. He left behind nearly 550,000 dead, captured, or missing soldiers. One of the largest military losses in human history. Of the nearly 700,000 men who had marched into Russia with such confidence in June, fewer than 100,000 stumbled back out alive. Napoleon had destroyed his own army through hubris, poor planning, and refusal to retreat when reason demanded it. Europe smelled blood. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Britain formed a new coalition and invaded France in 1813. Napoleon raised new armies, young, inexperienced conscripts who called themselves Marie-Louises after the Empress. He fought brilliantly with inferior forces, but even his genius couldn't overcome the mathematics of fighting all of Europe simultaneously while Spain continued bleeding French resources. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced over 350,000 coalition troops. He was defeated decisively. His German allies abandoned him mid-battle, switching sides to the coalition. His empire in Central Europe collapsed overnight. By early 1814, coalition armies were invading France itself. Napoleon's marshals, the men who'd followed him to glory across Europe, began to lose faith. They had estates now, titles, wealth. They wanted to preserve what they'd gained, not die defending Napoleon's crumbling empire. On April 6, 1814, his marshals confronted him and demanded he abdicate. Napoleon raged, threatened, and finally broke down. On April 11, he signed the abdication document. The Emperor of Europe was finished. The coalition exiled him to Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast, where he could rule over 10,000 subjects and pretend to still be an emperor. But Napoleon wasn't done yet. In March 1815, he escaped from Elba, landed in southern France with 1,000 loyal soldiers, and marched toward Paris. The government sent armies to stop him. Instead, the soldiers defected to Napoleon when he appeared before them and declared, "If any man would shoot his emperor, here I am." Within weeks, without firing a shot, Napoleon had reclaimed France. The 100 Days, as this period was called, ended at Waterloo in Belgium on June 18, 1815. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's British and Dutch forces while trying to defeat them before Prussian reinforcements could arrive. The battle was desperately close. Napoleon came within hours of victory. But the Prussians arrived. Napoleon's final attack, the legendary Imperial Guard marching uphill into British fire, was repulsed for the first time in their history. The cry went up. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. The French army broke and fled. Napoleon's last gamble had failed. This time, the British weren't taking chances. They exiled Napoleon to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe. There, guarded by British soldiers, Napoleon spent his final 6 years dictating memoirs, refighting his battles in words, and slowly dying. Possibly from stomach cancer, possibly from arsenic in the wallpaper, possibly from simple despair. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at age 51. His last words were reportedly, "France, Armée, tête d'armée, Josephine, France, Army, head of the army, Josephine." Even at the end, he was the soldier who'd risen from nothing and the man who'd sacrificed love for power. Napoleon's impact on history was profound and contradictory. He spread revolutionary ideals of legal equality and meritocracy across Europe while also establishing himself as a dictator. He modernized government administration and legal codes that still influence dozens of countries today. He demonstrated that talent and ambition could overcome birth and privilege, and also that unchecked ambition leads to catastrophic destruction. He caused the deaths of millions through his constant wars. He redrew Europe's map multiple times. He accelerated nationalism across the continent, ironically creating the very forces that would eventually destroy his empire. He proved that one extraordinary individual could reshape the world, and that even genius has limits when confronting reality, geography, and the will of nations refusing to submit. The bullied Corsican boy became emperor of Europe. The military genius who never lost became the defeated exile. The man who crowned himself ended in a British prison wearing out his days on a rock in the ocean. Napoleon's story is the ultimate rise and fall narrative, a testament to what ambition, brilliance, and will can achieve, and what hubris, overreach, and the refusal to accept limits can destroy. His legend lives on because his story captures something essential about human nature. The burning desire to prove ourselves, to overcome our origins, to reshape the world according to our vision. And the tragic reality that even the greatest among us are, in the end, only human. From nobody to emperor to exile, that's the Napoleon story. Genius and ego. Glory and catastrophe. The ultimate cautionary tale wrapped in the most spectacular rise in human history.